Christine Schneider, the visceral voice.
Welcome to the Visceral Voice Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Schneider. Through this podcast, I aim to bring you the most current, up-to-date research on voice science, function, pain science, movement, and everything in between. I am on a quest to learn everything I can about the living, breathing body and its intricate connection to the voice. This podcast documents the continuation of my learning and my experience as a professional singer, a nutritional consultant, a movement specialist, and a manual therapist. Join us as we strive to provide current, knowledgeable, creative, and compassionate information to help you restore, regain, and create happiness and success on your vocal journey. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by Susan Eichhorn Young today. You might have heard Susan's episode, Rising Like the Phoenix, which was an extraordinary and inspirational episode about her journey. But I also wanted to invite her back today to talk about hormones through the ages. So Susan Eichhorn Young is a voice teacher and a consultant in New York City and worldwide online. She works with singers in opera and music theater, cabaret, and recording artists around the globe. There is more of her bio on that episode, Rising Like the Phoenix, and I highly recommend listening to that episode because it really is transformative. So Susan, thank you so much for joining me again today to talk about hormones through the ages.
I'm honored, as always, to be with you.
Great. So let's I'd love to start by just kind of your journey into working with, you've created a program, which I want to talk about a little later, working with perimenopause and menopause. So certainly working through large hormonal shifts.
Yes.
And so if you don't mind just kind of bringing us through your journey, talking about your journey into that kind of work from sort of, your whole other group of work with professional elite vocal athletes on Broadway and in opera.
Well, it's interesting because my generation, which is a little ahead of you, we didn't get a lot of information. And frankly, we're now just beginning to let menopause and that whole aspect of hormonal change become a little more mainstream, but it's still not fully there. What I was noticing myself, even in my mid-30s, was changes to my cycle that were strange and bizarre. And, doctors would poo-poo it, or you'd get sent for an ultrasound and say, no, you're fine. And you went home and struggled through. And in retrospect, what I decided to do was I recognized that at 36 or 37, I'd already started perimenopause. And it was pretty intense, to say the least. And so as I started teaching, I guess it's been 20 years in New York now, working with Broadway singers and opera singers that were my age or maybe a little older, I started to use myself as the experiment and did, because I will say it straight up, I am not a doctor, nor do I pretend to be, nor do I play one on television. So this is anecdotal and practitioner based, but also based on research that I've done myself, but also talking to doctors and specialists as well. As I was going through my own process and trying to find professional medical people that understood it and would take it seriously from a voice perspective, not just from, a hormonal perspective, but what is this doing to the voice? And one of the first things that I discovered is it was a study done in France, male and female married doctors who started to explore the physiology during perimenopause, and therefore backed it up even to when you're having a regular cycle. And under the microscope, the gist of it was there is no difference under the microscope between cervical mucus and laryngeal mucus. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? So it isn't in my head, it's in my larynx. Right. And so that was fascinating to say, okay, when I'm feeling these changes, when I have my period, that is a real thing. There is change happening in that larynx as much as there is in the uterus and in the cervix. So as I progressed through perimenopause, and then into menopause and now postmenopause, and sadly, things continue to change in weird ways sometimes. You think you're through and something else will hit you like a hot flash. It just doesn't seem to want to let go. What I was recognizing in my own voice, I was seeing in my clients. So I started to use myself, like I say, as an experiment, just to see what was working, what wasn't working anymore. And my premise philosophically as a teacher is always the voice is fine. Where she chooses to reside, or he or they, depending on the pronoun of your voice, is not always optimal. So your voice is trying to get your attention, as opposed to saying there's something wrong with my voice. It's the physicality that needs your attention. And so that's been my focus in the studio anyway, but certainly with singers that are going through some of these hormonal changes, and singers that are, in the throes of womanhood cycles, and also women who are pregnant in different trimesters or postpartum, and how that, because that, our voices are hormonal, pure and simple.
Wow. That makes so much sense to me because it's part of what made me interested in having this conversation. I'm also perimenopause, leading towards menopause. But of course, throughout the years, we know that we have changes during our cycle. So let's just start there. When we go through puberty and we start to actually get our period and menstruate, we have changes that happen through that time period. So if you don't mind just kind of walking us through that aspect of hormonal change and what might be happening within the voice.
Well, one of the things, and again, every person is different as to when these things can affect. But if you look at how you physically feel just prior to menstruation, every month might be very different, and often is, right? Where you might have severe cramping or severe bloating or severe mood swings, or not, and everything from a little bit to nothing to a whole bunch of stuff. Those things affect everything else in the body. And I often see, that if you are really cramped or feel really bloated, very similar things respond laryngically, where the voice is sluggish or heavy. It doesn't want to move. It doesn't want to, you might even lose a few notes at the top of your registration because of the thickness of the folds themselves and the mucosa and the fascia, even, all of that stuff is being affected by that hormonal release. And then often as you start your period and into the period, things release again. The body releases quite literally, and therefore the larynx will release back to whatever normal is for you. Some women find too that when they're ovulating, they feel it in their voice first, because there is a slipperiness, there is an ease, there is an agility to the voice because everything has that freedom. And I think as singers and voice users, because we're using this instrument, we're so much more acutely aware of these subtle changes. They don't even have to be humongous changes that anyone else would notice, but we do because we're using that voice every day. So any subtle shift, right away. And then, this is where I think as singers, we get neurotic because we're dealing with such intangibles, right? Voice, vibration and breath and muscles we can't see, and sometimes can't feel, and so it's like, am I losing my mind or is that happening? And there's a good chance that no, you're right, it's happening.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah, it's interesting now, and I don't know how long they've been around. I've just recently heard of them in the last 15, 20 years of IUDs. And as people get IUDs that are, anywhere from, I don't know how, months to 5 years of having an IUD and not going through the menstrual cycle. And I don't actually know what happens with the hormones in that. Do you know anything about that? I don't
Yeah,
actually know about that.
I had one for quite a number of years too, because my cycles, and again, I was in perimenopause, but that was not determined.
Mm,
So I was actually bleeding 20 days of the month. So
mm,
I was severely anemic, and very heavy. So what happened is, having that IUD allowed for the the bleeding to alleviate. I had a very light period, and it's just because it releases either synthetic hormone or, I don't know I think it's progestin is really that's the primary hormone that's released, but I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. Check it out yourselves. Again, not a doctor. But um, but again, every woman's response physically is so different to these things. So what works and that worked for me, thank God. However, I had to have it removed suddenly because it was affecting my blood pressure
mm,
after several years. So my blood pressure was way too high. And I mean, it literally came out that day. That's how fast they
mm,
wanted it out. So that's how over time it affected me. Some women can't have it, their bodies just reject it.
mhm.
Other women have no problem. They just use it for a while, and it can help regulate. And some women have it and they have no period at all. So it's
Mm.
fascinating how the individual body responds, you know?
Yeah, I went in to get one a number of years ago, and I couldn't actually get one because the impulse through the uterus was they couldn't even do that. It was so
Wow.
excruciating. And then
Wow.
I do know a handful of people that had them that they went into the uterine wall. So they had to be removed because they went into the uterine wall, et cetera, too. So, and then coming to the topic of birth control, I've been on a number of birth controls that, as you said, you had bleeding for, 20 days. That's how I was with birth control. So going through a number of various different forms of birth control because I was put on it young, at a young age. I was 16 because I was not sexually active, and not because of that, but because I had ovarian cysts that just would not burst.
Yeah.
And so they put me on at a young age to help with that, which it did help with that. But then throughout the years, I had to keep changing because after being on birth control for however long, 6 months, a year and a
Yeah.
half, my body would change to the response of those, hormones or
Yes.
to that birth
Yeah.
control.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating how, our bodies have their own minds as to
Yeah.
what will work for you or not. And I think that's an important takeaway too, is no matter the hormone changes, we
Mm-hmm.
have, there is an approximation of things, but everybody is still so individual. And whatever you're feeling, whatever you're going through is normal for you. There is nothing that is abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
That is part of your physicality, your emotional, mental, and psychic health, really. And
And
finding someone who understands that's probably the trickiest thing.
that is, and having someone to help support you through that and make you know that, yeah, this is okay. I mean, I've seen
Yeah.
everything from someone they call out of their shows those 2 days
Yes.
before the period because they know they're really inflamed, and that's just kind of their monthly day off.
Yes. Yes.
All the way to someone continuing to go through, but having to make various different warm-up changes, and uh, maybe it's different kinds of slippery elm directly after a
Yeah.
show or
Right.
something like
Right.
that to
Yeah.
help. So I've seen kind of many, many different ideas and thoughts and how to work with their experience of inflammation, of the bloating that might be happening down low, and therefore the density,
Yes.
the thickness that we can feel around the
Yeah.
larynx.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I also had, and of course, this is TBD, we're learning more information on this all the time, but I definitely had menstrual changes when I had the vaccine for COVID. And so I had 1 month where it'd be like 2 days and another month where it'd be about 15 days.
Yeah. And we hear that a lot.
Mhm.
We've heard that a lot. There's a lot of women that have really experienced that, which is
Yeah,
fascinating,
it is. It is. Yeah. And we heard that pretty early too. I mean,
Yes.
they were
Yeah.
able to recognize that pretty quick
Yeah.
and started kind of doing research on that. I know a friend of mine um, she had COVID in 2020 and her cycle was impacted by the virus. She was part of the initial research for that.
Amazing.
So just interesting that there are other things that can greatly impact our menstrual cycle, our hormone levels, how our body's responding to this is
Hmm.
fascinating.
It
But
really
if
is.
that's happening within the body and our voice can be very hormonal or hormonally connected, then what's happening in our voice?
Yeah. Yeah. And the more we can, um, together, whether it's in the studio or, in your own practice, just explore and don't be afraid to get messy. Just play with it to see, okay, this is what I'm sensing today. This is how it feels today. Like really getting into that, that it doesn't have to be textbook. It has to be physical. How does it feel physically, but then how does it make me feel?
Mm,
you know and that is a very important connection, because I have seen too many women of a certain age come into the studio to say, I don't even know if I want to sing anymore, because they
mm,
just don't know what's going to happen. And that breaks my heart, because if you as an artist still have something to say, this should not hold you back. So,
mm,
that was part of, why I started to kind of focus in on that. And, even with my pregnant clientele, um, you know, uh, working right up until, you know, the week before they have a baby. I
mm,
mean, it's possible. Yeah, you're going to be tired and all those things, but it's recognizing that, that body is there for you. It's not going to
mm,
betray you during
mm,
these times. It feels like a betrayal because it's something you're not used to. But when you start to just take it at face value and recognize what that is, then you really see the incredible possibility within each type of hormone change,
mhm.
you
Well,
know?
let's talk a little bit about that with pregnancy because that, I've I've lived through a pregnancy
Yeah.
and childbirth, but it's interesting because I had so many people talk to me about, what are you noticing vocally through this time?
Mhm.
And I actually felt like my voice got better
Yeah. Yeah. Yes,
through
definitely.
that time
Yeah.
then. And I think part of that too is that when I was performing, I did take beta blockers in order to perform.
Mhm.
And I could not take a beta blocker,
Right.
obviously, while I was
Yeah.
pregnant. So I had a performance while I was pregnant, and I was not able to take a beta blocker to calm my nervous system a little bit. Although there's way more that's happening with a beta blocker than calming the nervous system, but that's for another topic in
Yeah. Yeah.
podcast. um, and I feel like I was able to get through those performances because I had the energy of my baby. I had my
Yeah.
energy of Lily.
Yeah.
So that was able to kind of get me through
Yeah.
mentally. But what have you noticed within your demographic and teaching when someone's pregnant? What is happening through those changes with the voice?
Well, I hear sometimes even before I know they're pregnant, I hear another level of warmth in the tone,
Mm,
in the mid voice right away in first trimester.
wow.
Um, and I mean, you know, sounds a little woo, I know, but I think maybe it's just like low these 30 years of teaching. I've had, a few pregnancies come through the studio.
F you.
um, and so that's something. And one of the cool things I think is that warmth continues to expand the
Mm,
voice throughout the pregnancy, and it's not lost after the pregnancy. I've never seen any of my clients lose that warmth after
mm,
at postpartum. So that's fascinating, and that's something that happens pretty quickly. um, I think depending on how, you're feeling, because everybody again goes through all kinds of different physical changes, but also, nausea and fatigue and all of those things. There is, especially later, like third trimester, second trimester, everything loosens up, like the joints are loosening, etc.
mhm.
And so
Yeah.
there can be a destabilization laryngically,
Mhm.
where all of a sudden everything is just loose and you feel like you can't control. So, that's when we do a lot of stability kind of exercises. Um, but throughout the pregnancy, as the baby's growing, depending on what direction that baby wants to stretch, it becomes clearer and clearer. And I've had a couple of clients literally still in the delivery room text me to say, I get it now. Like, what about that pelvic floor?
Mm,
And they understand that connection,
mhm.
but there again, the pelvic floor and how the hormones are setting you up to birth. And again, any birth is normal, no matter
Mhm.
whether you're birthing vaginally, whether you have medical help, whether pain management or have to have a C-section, it's all normal. And it affects all of that. I have the rare delight, if I can plug her for 2 seconds, my daughter through COVID decided to become a birth doula, and she is now a birth educator. And
Mm,
so I've learned even more through her as she's been on this journey, working with birthing people who, as she's discovering, and she's a singer actor,
mm,
going into birth work. So it's been a fascinating balance to see, as I'm working with several pregnant clients at the moment, to have her input and her ideas and stuff. And she's a mom too, so she's been through it and she understands it. But it is fascinating that warmth is something that comes in or seems to come in first. Then
mhm,
there can be heaviness, stiffness, and then all of a sudden everything loosens up again.
mhm.
And then oftentimes, just before You do get a little more edema and all of that, there is a little more swelling. Sometimes the folds don't want to come together as evenly. There can be a little bit of vibrato change just as you're getting close, So, I mean, that's being very broad in the observation, but it is fascinating to see that progress. But what I do see with the birthing people that sing through their pregnancy, because yes, you can do that. Is that the recovery time, no matter the type of birth you have, is so much quicker postpartum. I mean, just to get your body back into singing shape, quote unquote, it comes so much quicker than if you just stopped singing. And it doesn't mean you got to be performing, but if you're just, continuing to stretch that voice on a regular basis, it can really make a difference in the recovery.
You're continuing to manage and build pressure.
Yes.
Through the changes, and then your body has been doing that, which makes so much sense to me. After my pregnancy, people think this is a wonderful thing, but I will tell you, it is not. I lost all of the weight except for 5 pounds within the first week. I lost the weight very quickly. I gained 32 pounds with Lily, and I lost all but 5 pounds within that first week.
Yeah.
So when you lose weight quickly, talk about a pressure shift. And having to manage that pressure is very challenging.
Yeah.
And so there's another episode on the podcast with Nicholas Simpson who talks about a lot of weight loss and how you go through the process of weight loss. And of course, with pregnancy, we are losing quite a bit of weight very quickly, which impacts our pressure. And we still have elastin in the body that has, I mean, we always do, but we have more that's allowing that agility that allowed the body to come through, or the baby to come through the body. And then for many women, I think more than what are even aware, have some kind of postpartum depression.
Absolutely.
I
because
think,
again, those hormones shift right back to pre-pregnancy, literally in a second, like it happens so fast. The body says, "Oh, we're not pregnant anymore," and there's no, like, it's, your head spins and you don't know what to do with that. So there's no gradual release back as there has been toward pregnancy. Post-pregnancy, it's just zip,
like the
you're
slingshot
done.
back.
Exactly. So that definitely, is going to affect the physicality and the emotional and the mental. And that's where it's so important to have the support systems around you. I honestly believe every person who is pregnant, yes, you can have your midwife or your OB and all of those things, your doula, your whoever your birth team is, but you need that postpartum team. You need that. It's so crucial. And again, you're not crazy. This is real. This is what hormones do to our psyche, and everything you're feeling is normal. It's what you do with that's crucial, how you can get the support that you need. And I think, honestly, seeing my daughter go through it, she's been very, I can say that because she's been very public about that process, because she really wants to open that up for people. If birthing people can get in place their mental health team before they birth, I think that would make such a difference in that certainly in the beginning of postpartum, because in a strange way, from a hormonal perspective, you are postpartum until you start perimenopause.
Right.
Technically, I mean, that's really, after
your body has changed.
Yep. Exactly.
It can't go back to where it was before.
And so then and then the next change begins, and you can be in perimenopause and still get pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
Audra
Sure.
McDonald is a great example of that, as she's been public about that too.
Mm-hmm.
One does not negate the other at
Mm-hmm.
all.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's a really important component and conversation to have and to bring up and to address of that postpartum. And though there is only a certain percentage of birthing people who are diagnosed with postpartum depression, I I mean, I would venture to say that most of us at least experience
oh, absolutely.
some.
Something.
I certainly did.
Pardon me.
Absolutely. Yeah, no problem. And um, I I developed a team. I put together a team, but I just didn't even think about,
No.
I went into pregnancy just not knowing a lot about what my body and what I was about to go through. But I did have support, thank goodness. I did take some maca root, which helped me a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
So there are definitely things that can help. So I love that you mentioned postpartum all the way until perimenopause, because wow, that's really true and definitely resonates as I'm in perimenopause. And I
Yeah.
feel, about 2 years after pregnancy, I definitely felt like I was really starting to come back in and understand my body in a
Yeah.
new way. It did take a while for me
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
understand that. And then now I was also in my late 30s when I think I started developing some symptoms of
Mm-hmm.
perimenopause, whether my hormones whether we see it in my blood work with my
Yeah.
hormones or not. I
Yeah.
certainly noticed it. I get some vertigo. I definitely have had some voice changes, which of course is how I noticed it,
Yeah.
which were
Yeah.
these slight little voice changes. And I'm like, why am I getting these little hiccups? Am I getting spasmodic dysphonia? What's
Yeah.
happening? And it was like, no, I'm not. It's just my hormones are
Yeah.
changing and I'm
Yeah.
perimenopausal.
Yeah.
So let's chat now about
Yeah.
what you see as your clients come into perimenopause.
So what's fascinating is there's lots of interesting, not just the regular quote unquote what you read about, symptoms. There's lots of
Mhm.
Individual symptoms. I mean, I'm coughing on the podcast, and that's one of them. Actually,
Mhm.
that's something that I did develop, and I mean, it's the weather and all of the rest of it too. But there can be sort of this lingering cough
Mhm.
that a lot of women experience in perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, which is fascinating to me. The usual, like the hot flashes and the itchy skin and the unable to sleep well, and all of those things, which then deregulates your whole system. Vocally, what I often will hear is a thickness in the tone, that won't allow for release into a chest dominant position where there might have been before.
Mhm.
Um, there can be a destabilization of resonance in the mid voice, and everything seems to happen in the mid voice for us. It's the bane of our existence and the most important part of everything. So we lose, sometimes, a sense of anchoring,
Mhm.
and then we start to lose that elasticity. So that elasticity can show up in pitch, um, issues or vibrato issues. Um, Passaggi tend to get tighter than normal. And oftentimes, you can lose, um, initially anyway, you can lose, actual notes from both directions, I've
Mhm.
seen, and sometimes vehemently, which is frightening, when all of a sudden it's like, I'm used to, this is usually my sweet spot and it's not anymore. So what is that about? And that's part of what's happening, how those hormones, are resetting the physicality of the of the mechanism. And that's why I really love to say your voice is trying to get your attention here. She's fine, but she's not happy because something's not right here, that, this isn't what she's used to. So how do we get that back? And that, we hear, the old adage of, the older church lady with the wobble. That's menopause. And that can change, like that can be changed. I've seen that. I've worked with women who come in with a wobble and they're afraid to sing in public anymore because someone has told them, or they've recognized it, and they don't want to perform anymore. They don't want to sing. And that can be re-regulated, through the right exercise and the right approach. And sometimes I think singers, when they're given permission, again, to say, you're normal, there's nothing wrong with you. Let's just figure this out together. I think just that permission is so crucial. And I think too, because in the medical world, we're starting to see more conversation about all of this. But I follow this wonderful menopause doctor on social media. Her name is Dr. Mary Claire Haver, Haver. And she has a new book coming out. I'm going to plug it because it looks, I've already pre-ordered it, called The New Menopause. And what she talks about is that in medical school, doctors don't get less than 20 hours of training in hormones. 20 hours. That's insane.
Yeah.
So you lean into the medical community for help, and they don't know. You might know more because it's your body than they know. And so, slowly we're starting to see, doctors that are specializing now in hormones. And it's not just endocrinology. It really is specific to perimenopause and menopause. And I think that's exciting, but it's so ass backwards, and so late because even when I was pregnant, we weren't given any information. And certainly in my mother's era at all. But I really wasn't either. I just lucked out that I ended up with a doctor who was incredible and was able to really, address things and let me know. Which was unheard of, really, in the 80s. In the late 80s, it still was, you just didn't talk about it as much. You certainly, you did your Lamaze class or whatever, right? But you didn't really learn what was going on. And then certainly, when I approached perimenopause, nobody even mentioned the word to me. And that wasn't that long ago, So.
And you also hear, I certainly started noticing changes, as you mentioned, in my late 30s. But I also, as I would discuss it with my doctors, they'd say, you're too young. Well, my mom was through menopause at 40, at the age of 40. Yeah. So I'm 44. I am not menopausal yet. I'm still in perimenopause. But I've certainly been in perimenopause since my late 30s. I know the different changes, and it took me forever to find articles saying that, yes,
I know,
with perimenopause, you might experience vertigo. You might, some of the things are like, no, it would not be, it's not because you're perimenopausal at all. But as I'm piecing things together, I'm like, no, I really think that these particular things are happening because I'm perimenopausal.
and vertigo is something, I see that in the studio, not so like even dizziness at certain frequencies that will happen. And it can throw, it throws a singer completely. It's like, why am I suddenly dizzy? Or why am I breathless when I've been able to sing that phrase and now suddenly I can't? All of that has a hormonal aspect to it. And so when you realize that, okay, it's frustrating, but let's figure it out together, because no, you're not doing anything wrong. No, your technique is not, you know, bad, or, you know, wandering away from you and leaving you high and dry. It's now, what else does that body need so that the voice will behave herself and be happy to come in, back in, and move in and work with you. And it's they're now saying, I just read this the other day, they're now saying that the average age of menopause is 51 overall. So you can start Peri at 35 easily, you know, and that can last for 10, 15 years, you know, before you actually make that shift.
Yeah.
And then there's some, you know, some women will think, oh God, one more month and I'm in menopause, and then they get a period, you know. So it can just last, that perimenopause can last a long time. And so in that process, there's so much hormonal shift going on, and it affects everything. The other thing that I was reading the other day, and I've certainly seen it in people that I know, and anecdotally, mental health issues can rear during these hormonal. So again, mental health issues and hormones are very much connected too. So it isn't just the physical, you know. There is, I mean, just like postpartum depression, there are things through peri and post that will occur as well.
I remember thinking growing up, hearing various friends and everything through their menstrual cycle talk about PMS. Oh, I'm just PMSing. And I'd always thought that it was just, I knew what it meant, but I didn't have those. I definitely had severe cramping, but I didn't have kind of PMS. And then I had my daughter, and then I developed PMS, where all of a sudden 2 days before, it wasn't the bloating and inflammation I felt intense anxiety.
Yes.
And I was like, what is happening right now? And then my husband would say, well, you have been getting this every month. And he kind of every month had to remind me for several years, because I just didn't remember. And it wasn't the same experience through my menstrual cycle as it had been.
Yes.
So suddenly it became way more of some mental experiences rather than more of a physical experience. And of course, sometimes it's both. So interesting that, of course, you know, it absolutely makes sense that we would have those experiences. So as someone then does make the transition from perimenopausal to menopause and menopausal and postmenopausal, what do you see in your clients from that shift vocally?
Depending on where they're coming from, like if they come to me, or they haven't been doing sort of the work of preparing vocally, there can be a lot of stiffness in the mechanism, and it can mirror muscle tension dysphonia, all kinds of, not to say that it can actually exacerbate those issues too. But there is a lot of stiffness, and there again, if there's stiffness, our natural tendency is to push. So the voices fatigue a lot faster. The tone can be brittle. You know, the larynx doesn't have the freedom. It gets heavy. Like the hormones, the cartilages literally are heavier, so those ligaments are holding on for dear life. And so if you don't keep that elasticity throughout that process, by the time you get to menopause or postmenopause, that larynx can almost just feel like stone. You know, it doesn't have that movement and freedom. And I know you, with your work, you know, I'm sure you're hands-on to those things, you know, all too well. And, you know, all those little clicky things and stuff we feel when we're singing, or even when, you know, you're teaching us how to do a little bit of massage work, and you can hear those clicks and stuff. I mean, it's just like the rest of the body. you get stiff. You don't have the range of motion you had before. You've got, you try getting out of bed can be interesting some days if you have, just as we age, this is what starts to happen. And so it makes sense then logically that of course it's going to affect that larynx. If the rest of your body's stiff, your larynx is part of your body. But so often, again, the singer psyche won't, it just, we have to coax singers to go that extra step, to say, okay, if you're stiff, if you have osteoporosis or you're beginning to get those issues with the bones, guess what? It's affecting this too. Right? I mean, we have to holistically take your body is your instrument. It isn't just your larynx, but your larynx is part of your instrument, is part of your physicality. So we really need to address that. And I believe, just in my own experience, that every woman who is menopausal or postmenopausal can access more elasticity and agility back into their voice. It might not be what it was in their 30s, but we're not in our 30s anymore, and on it all sounds like, oh, struggle and work and blah, blah, blah. But there is something very empowering as we age, that with life experience, and the changes and whatever, even if you're, if you're moving Peri through post and you never had children, right? You still carry life experience. You have still birthed your life experience. So there, you do get to a point where you don't have to prove yourself to anybody. And that's empowering. So as you discover then what that voice will do now, there's still lots to say. You might not have the range you had 30 years ago. But what can you say where it lives? I just think that there's still so much more we can do and say and be as we discover what that physicality will allow us to do. And, again, we are multidimensional creatures. So it isn't an all or nothing. At least, that's how I really like to view it,
Yes, I like to view it the same. And so to the listeners, really quick, there is an episode on the podcast with Erin Johnson on the aging voice. So as Susan was mentioning, the various differences or things that start to happen as the larynx begins to ossify as we get older. Erin does go into the science of that. Susan just mentioned all of that because we really want to be talking and open to the understanding for everyone. But if you do want to delve into more of what is actually happening, then go ahead and check out Erin Johnson's episode. But coming back to what you were just describing of being able to, well, first, if you're really catching on at perimenopause and saying, hey, you know what, I think I want to keep training this agility and making sure that I have this range of motion and I'm not going to develop the stiffness, that can make the transition easier, but yet it is still possible even after. I do want to now, if it's okay, bring up, you have a virtual self-paced program on your website that I have purchased, the Perimenopause and Menopause. So working with the voice through those. So if we can chat about this a little bit, I'd love for the listeners to know about it. I think the program is phenomenal. It's incredibly helpful. I don't think, personally, I don't think it's just, as we mentioned, as someone that might not have been a professional voice user, might not realize and get diagnosed with muscle tension dysphonia, possibly even other diagnosis. I don't know, although it is sort of what I see as someone starts working to do some voice training and to do some movement training, getting out of some of those voice patterns, which I think is really empowering because you hear certain diagnosis and you think that's it. And there's nothing else to be done. So let's so you have three parts
Mhm.
to your program, and I'd love
Yeah,
to just run through and let us know
absolutely.
about this program because it really is extraordinary.
Well, I mean, and I thank you for that. And I'm always going to be tweaking and things, but I wanted it to be something that any singer of any genre could access and then adjust to their level and to what they need specifically, and try to keep it as um, ease filled as possible, because the overwhelm of hormones is such a big deal. So the breakdown of you know getting into the anchoring, the massage through vibration, and trying to just get an ease in the mechanism, because I'm always amazed, and I've certainly met and worked with singers who literally there is no movement in that at all
Mm-hmm.
from a vibrational perspective. So everything is squeezed and pushed. So that first section is just giving you permission to say, how much ease do I have right now? And how can I then explore how, increment by increment, to just get that to start to respond. And I mean, you can stay with that forever, and just work with that just to keep that, because that's really the premise of everything. If you don't have that range of motion initially, nothing else is going to happen. And then the other two, which I do have separated, is elasticity of the instrument, and the voice, and the physicality, and then the agility of that. And to my work, they're not the same. They inform each other, but they're not the same. So there are three very specific classes that I take you through, a lot of exercise work that you can then personalize to your tessituras, to your vocal ability, and adjust and work accordingly, so that you don't have to do it exactly the way I've laid it out, but just experiment and find out what makes the best sense for you. And then you're working with me, um, as you want to, in real time on demand, if that makes any sense at all. Or then you can just take those exercises and then work them on your own in the keys that make sense, adjust them to your own personal preference, so that you begin to discover how to just access that instrument again fully.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter if you're just beginning the process and you still have some agility and elasticity, or if you got nothing. There's what I wanted to do is just create something that would give everybody, no matter, and again, whether you're a theater singer, whether you've been a belter your whole career, whether you're an opera singer, and or whether you're working with a microphone in a club, like, we're all the same in that approach to that physicality. It doesn't matter, and how you access that physicality is just or you and your teacher, or you and your team of healthcare people, just to keep exploring that, because there again, then it can take you to you, Christine, to say, okay, I need hands-on laryngeal work here. I can't do this all myself.
Mm-hmm.
Or one of the bonus of the class is I talk with Dr. Linda Dahl, who's one of the top laryngologists in New York City, and she works very holistically. She's a scientist who has the holistic balance, and she has dropped some wonderful knowledge in that conversation too, so that you do build your team, so that you can recognize what's the baseline right now, like what does it look like,
Mm.
and then how do I exercise that, and then what does it look like in 6 months. What does it feel like when you're working with a manual therapist from today to 6 months from now? and really getting that information to become more concrete, more tangible, so that it isn't oh my God, what's going on with me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I part of what I love about the program, one is obviously how it helps my voice feel, the ease that I feel afterwards.
Good.
But also it's really fascinating because I haven't done exercises like them before. So I think that, for me, being able to, and this is not, I mean, I love my voice teacher so much.
Absolutely.
But I do feel like it can be such a great addition to work. It's not taking away from work. It's not. So if someone has, their vocal training that they're doing, I think that's phenomenal. And I think this just helps to bring in some of those qualities and ideas and, brain understanding, motor control understanding.
Right. Yeah.
That can be really, really beneficial. So I highly, highly recommend Susan's program to the listeners for peri and post menopause. I think that it's an incredible addition. And again, I also think it's wonderful for folks who are experiencing various different, maybe you've had a diagnosis of muscle tension dysphonia, potentially even spasmodic dysphonia, or some kind of paresis or something like that. Being able to add these drills in, I think could be a great addition. So.
And that's what they are. They're not to replace what you already know and do. And, it's there to enhance, and just give you, a slightly different, just a different angle on things. And if it helps, that's what I'm here to do. I mean, if someone contacts me and says, I just say, get your butt in here and let's figure it out. You don't have to be feeling like it's gone and it's done, especially, and in this time, what I am so excited to see is that we're starting to talk about it. Women who are pregnant are not having to hide that. They can walk into an audition and not pretend they're not pregnant. They can walk into a role and be pregnant if they're comfortable physically to be in that role. And we want to extend that now to the world that is peri through post. That if you still have the energy to be on stage, then be on stage. And just, let that voice be who she is and give her permission to stretch, because you've given your body permission to stretch and not to feel like you must hide away and become a crone in the woods. Although there's something to be said about that too.
Sometimes we need that too.
Yes, we do.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation.
My pleasure.
With me, Susan. It is always so inspiring to talk with you. And to the listeners, as you can see, Susan is such a light and definitely just one of my kin, those of us who believe that there's always hope, there's always something that we can do. So thank you so much. I just had such a wonderful time in this last hour. So thank you for being here with me.
Oh, my pleasure. As always, it's great to see you.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, tell your colleagues, students, and friends. Subscribe, rate, and please write a review. You can find us on Instagram or Facebook, and feel free to check out my website at www.thevisceralvoice.com for information on programs and upcoming events. I hope you join us next time for another wonderful conversation on The Visceral Voice.